Hello, just a welcome to the Passionist Peace and Reconciliation office here in Ardoyne. I've been asked to share with you something about the struggle to find a vision of hope as I encounter the wonderful but wounded city of Belfast. A vision of hope that is open and welcoming to all, and that gives a dignity and a purpose to the lives of everyone. Just to assure you of the theological depth that we're going to get to in this reflection, I want to state at the beginning that my reflection could be summarised in 5 words. Hope is not like gin. And we'll come back to that. What do I mean by that? I'm often intrigued by billboards that we see around the city. British Telecom once used a poster that depicted 2 ostriches standing back to back with their heads buried in the sand. The slogan ran, "I won't ring my brother until he rings me." Well, we know where that got to. The aim is to hook into our feelings of guilt to make us use their products. I remember the massive advertising campaign promoting eggs, following the Salmonella scare sparked by the words of Edwina Curry a few years back. One billboard had a well done up lady egg with a slogan beside her that ran, "I used to have a boyfriend until someone poached him." It's very sad. I also remember an advert for gin on a giant billboard that once you could see as you drove across the Albert Bridge. In the distance, there was a large blue swimming pool. And as you drove closer, you could see a slogan arising out of the swimming pool that stated, "Out of the blue comes." And right beside the slogan was a bottle of gin, being carried, as it were, directly into the outstretched hand of a lady in a red bikini who was lounging at the side of the pool. The message was clear. Out of the blue comes gin. Whatever hope is, it is not like that. It does not suddenly appear as out of the blue. Hope belongs right at the heart of our life experience and can only come out of that lived experience. Otherwise, it risks becoming irrelevant to the lived lives of people who are searching for meaning. But if hope is not like gin, I would also suggest that building peace and reconciliation in this wounded city is also not like gin. It doesn't suddenly come out of the blue. Peace is still a delicate commodity, particularly in areas that have been scourged by division during years of conflict. Recent events have shown us that healing and reconciliation cannot be built upon playing on the mistrust and suspicion between communities. We need courageous, religious, political and civic leaders who are prepared to take the risks of reaching out, building new relationships in which faith, identity and culture are fully embraced and cherished by all. Reconciliation is a word that perhaps we have become almost too used to. It doesn't mean anything anymore. But maybe we need to discover a new meaning for this often used word. It comes from Latin. The fact I know that is astonishing, given that I failed every Latin exam I ever sat in St Malachy's. But the word can be broken into 4 parts. Re means again. Con means with. Cili, C-I-L-I, is the Latin word for eyelash, and ation denotes an action. So the word reconciliation literally means the act of bringing back into eyelash contact again. The ability to touch eyelashes with another person, to look into another person's eyes without barriers or obstacles between us. For me, that's a very different and dynamic understanding of reconciliation that calls us to go further than we ever thought about before. The courage to look straight into each other's eyes. I believe that what we are being challenged to face up to in these days in this wounded and wonderful city is summed up well by T.S. Eliot in his poem 4 Quartets. Last season's fruit is eaten, and the fulfilled beast shall kick the empty pail. For last year's words belong to last year's language, and next year's words await another voice. We are waiting on another voice, and we are being challenged to co-create something new that hasn't existed before. Tolkien was writing his epic stories about the struggle between good and evil at the same time as C.S. Lewis. In his book, The Fellowship of the Ring, he says, "I wish none of this had ever happened." Can we not all identify with that statement in relation to the conflict in this wonderful city? I wish none of it had ever happened. But he goes on to say, the only choice you have to make is what will you do with the time that has been given to you. The only choice we have to make is what will we do with the time that has been given to us. So as a community that is home for people who profess both different faith and no faith allegiances, how can we together promote the healing of this wounded and wonderful city of Belfast? There are people around us who tell us that we need to move on, to forget the past, to almost, as it were, put a line under it. Perhaps though one of our problems is that we have forgotten too soon the horror of the conflict we endured, and in doing so robbed ourselves of the energy we need to create a new shared community together. We ignore the past at the risk of recreating it in the future. But facing up to the past must not only include looking at violent acts, but also the violent, unjust political structures, the unjust systems that facilitated discrimination and lack of equality. It is no accident that among those most committed to peace today are those most affected by and involved in the experience of the conflict, now working together towards a new vision. The vision proclaimed by Jesus in the 4th chapter of Luke's Gospel is a vision of peace. As part of the Gospel, I think, is very precious, and we ought to go back to it many times to build up our hope, to build up our determination of what can be. Jesus proclaims the vision as he comes into the synagogue where he grew up. You remember the passage. It's the beginning of his public life. They give him the scroll to read. He unrolls it carefully until he finds the words of the prophet Isaiah, and then he reads, "The Spirit of God is upon me. God sent me to proclaim good news to the poor, to give the blind new sight, to set the downtrodden free, to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim God's year of jubilee, of blessing." This is a vision that speaks of a time when all debts will be set aside and where all people will be welcome. It's a vision of breaking beyond barriers and boundaries and borders. An opportunity for a new beginning. A time for peace, when everyone will share all that God has given us. A time when there will be fullness of life for every person. That's the vision. What would it mean for this wounded and wonderful city if we look beyond our green and orange borders to both celebrate the richness and to recognise the woundedness of those we perceive to be the other? What would it mean for this wounded and wonderful city if orange and green together reached out in welcome to those wounded people who have come from foreign shores to find a new home among us? If you want a clear example of what it means when Jesus proclaims the reign of God and how this world has to be transformed to become that reign of God, you find it in the story of Niall O'Brien, an Irish Columban missionary priest who worked in the Philippines during the Marcos regime, falsely arrested and accused of the murder of the town's mayor. Each time Father Niall wore a stole when he celebrated Mass, it had a particular logo on it. It was an image of the dove of peace that was coming into land, but it was prevented from landing by circles of barbed wire. On the barbed wire were two hands with blood coming from them, as it were from pulling the barbed wire apart. The message was that the dove of peace could only land when people had the courage to absorb the pain of the barbs. A wonderful modern day story of the Passion. Who among us will have the courage to absorb the pain of the barbs, to allow the dove of peace to land, and for healing and true freedom to begin? But we have examples of countless women and men who on the streets of Belfast do that very same thing as the healing process goes on, who proclaim the work of justice, teaching the need for change, teaching the need for transformation of their community, once filled with injustice and division, to be replaced by equality and a respect for difference. A community where orange and green are not seen as a source of conflict, but part of a growing array of different colours and cultures in this wonderful city. One thing I did struggle with when I listened to people talking about getting rid of orange and green politics, it starts to sound like an unattainable aspiration to rid our community of something that is precious to our core. For me, patriotism and loyalty are good things. I'm proud to be green. I'm also proud of my grandmother, who came from the Shankill Road, Berlin Street. So my greenness is tinged, but not tarnished by orange. Loyalism and patriotism are causes to be celebrated. But when orange and green demonise each other and create fear and suspicion, then they become distorted and life-taking rather than life-giving. And what we did to each other in the past, we now do to Muslims, to the Polish community, to the Syrian community who have come to live among us. So what's on the agenda of church life today, if not the healing of a city that has been both wounded and wounding? And how can such healing be facilitated in and through the churches? The gospel invites us to bring our city's pain and hurt to the surface so that they can be transformed and people can be healed. What would it look like if we work to make the kingdom of God a reality in this wounded and wonderful city? I based the following conclusion upon an initial reflection by Father Kieran Early, a regular visitor to this part of the city during the 1980s. The kingdom of God in Belfast. The kingdom of God is here when walls of separation come tumbling down, to be replaced by the warm arms of embrace, where diversity is recognised as a gift to be cherished rather than as a threat to be overcome. When we recognise the equality of dignity we share with our fellow human beings. When we show genuine love and care, especially to those in pain, poverty and deep need. The kingdom of God is here when we struggle to create a situation when our elderly can sleep soundly in their beds at night and our young people can fulfill their God-given potential.